First of all, I cannot tell you what a gift this is to be here to speak in honor of Alex. So thanks first of all to Osnat, who has just been incredible in organizing this, the Israel Museum, Esti and Yonatan for being here, and for all of you as well. This is a picture I took the first day I met Alex, which is, we're arguing about it, but it's probably about 10 years ago. And Osnat is probably chain smoking somewhere on the left side of the picture. But it was one of the first shows that I was asked to do anywhere outside of graduating from college. I was very nervous to come to meet the curator at the Israel Museum, and of course, was sort of blindsided by this short powerhouse of a character who came to speak to me in a Scottish accent that, even by Scottish standards, is like kind of comical. I think Scottish people themselves would think that he was making fun of Scottish people when he spoke. And then, of course, when he spoke Hebrew, it was even more comical to hear someone. But I think, as many of us know, Alex is just one of the most remarkable and original and special people that we've ever met. And he was incredibly integral to me growing into someone that I am today. An avuncular character, totally informal, totally loving. I love him and I miss him very much. I'm going to present quite recent work, so I apologize if some of the presentation is not very refined, but it's work I haven't actually shown, I haven't talked about yet. Some of it has just been completed this summer, so I apologize if I'm a little bit jittery during this presentation. I'm going to talk about 4 projects, quite recent ones. So the first one starting in 2010, called I Cling to Virtue. And something I think that is becoming consistent in the way that I've worked recently is that I'm looking more and more at historical material, so taking a historical period and trying to address it through a particular storytelling format or a narrative genre. So something we know, like a family saga or a comedy or a horror genre. I've been looking at different historical periods, looking at them through this sort of lens of fiction, and then seeing what kind of things come out of it: objects, films, texts sometimes, photographs. And the one that I think really started me on this path is a project I did with Onkar Kular, who is a Sikh, someone I collaborate with a lot, who also knew Alex very well. And we decided to produce a kind of family saga about the 20th century, so accumulating stories from our own family. And the way we started to create this project was to fictionally intermarry our own families. So during the late 60s, the swinging 60s in London, one of his family members, that's his family on the right, falls in love with someone from my family. That's my Lithuanian Jewish family on the left. I'm sure some of you recognize the people there. They all look similar. And then this fictional family is born. These two very disparate communities join. And then a whole series of stories about immigration, about intergenerational conflict, about a huge scale of stories is able to be told through the lens of a family, right? You can tell the most intimate stories. You can also tell stories that encompass global issues, because these families move through these very, these different scales of storytelling. We also combined our own real family histories with family histories from other people, some of them much more well-known, like the Kennedys or the Rothschilds, and also fictional families like Faulkner's Snopes family. And so started to weave this very blurry mixture of fact and fiction. And then we produced a series of objects, 28 objects, that were exhibited at the Victoria and Albert Museum in this amazing, absolutely incredible space where people are allowed to walk through, and each object has a small story that places it within the 20th century. So I can go through some of the slides. And again, a lot of these objects, I think within a museum context, we hoped were interesting because some of them are not objects that can be actually archived by a museum. And so they're more like memorial objects or memory objects. They're ghosts of objects because they relate to a very specific moment in time, a time that is come and gone. So, the father was a hypochondriac, so these are all the pills he ingested. There's a story about a fish, which of course cannot be archived by a museum to tell a specific story. These things are ephemeral, they live and they die. This is one of our favorite pieces. It's a bar mitzvah cake in the shape of a stormtrooper. So again, we move through this 20th century, through these objects. And then the last thing we did as part of the project was we imagined that someone had made a film about the family, and then rather than make the film itself, because we don't have the money to do so, we just created the end credits. So we hired a cast that we thought looked like us or looked like our family and produced the final end credits in a very traditional manner. So I'll play that now. Okay, the second project I'm going to show is called Precoup. It was a solo show in Geneva. It was a very gluttonous show. I was basically given the opportunity to produce new work with a somewhat decent budget, and I was interested at the time in kind of addressing a period after World War II in America when psychiatry became very popular. So psychoanalytic theory, Freudian theory suddenly became a mainstream phenomenon. Middle-class people were going to see psychiatrists, and a whole world inside our minds was opening up. Often these worlds were considered dormant or hidden, sometimes subversive, sometimes highly sexualized. And as a result, Hollywood began producing what's now known as the kind of psychological thriller or horror genre. Often in this genre, psychiatry played an important role. Sometimes the psychiatrist was a good figure, so this psychiatrist was helping a person uncover secret elements within their own consciousness that could let them solve some problem that the film was providing. Other times the psychiatrist was evil, was actually the villain in the story, manipulating people, making them do things they didn't want, putting ideas into their heads. And through essentially 40 years of horror films, which I saw most of them during this period, so I'm still not totally okay, you start to find these hardened representations of psychosis that continuously repeat themselves over 4 decades. And so I started to accumulate these codes, these cinematic codes, which are like a series of different ways that these psychoses get represented physically, twins, mental traumas that get taken out of our brain and transmogrified into some physical form. Telephones play a big part, scissors, hair, blood, mirrors. And through the kind of accumulation of these different tropes, I produced my own story, my own screenplay, and then began to physicalize some of the elements within the film. And so this is the installation, which you sort of move around. And the idea, ideally, is that you walk in and there are points in a constellation in the film. There are these objects that have sort of come out of the film into the real world. And there's a gap in between them, and you, as the audience, have to fill in the gap of how these things connect within the logic of, let's say, a story. So also, ideally, you're also moving into your own psychological state to try and figure out what connects these disparate elements. So I'll just show, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a mattress with a Rorschach stain on it. Again, twins, wigs, some way of changing one's identity. So all these are sort of positioned in location, and ideally the audience is piecing together what connects them. This is a metronome that is used as a tool for conducting a trance state, so it's clicking there. And a polygraph machine is scratching during the time. So there's sort of also a soundtrack. And then you get to Rebecca, who is at the end of a corridor, who's waiting for you, and you have to go basically find her and see what lays behind this, these bandages. And this was produced with an amazing horror prosthetic specialist who works for the film industry. So it's a silicone mold, and we dressed her in an old 40s outfit. And that's her. So I'll show sequences. There were 2 clips from this film that doesn't exist that I'll show now, side by side, which also serve as a looping soundtrack to the installation. The next project I just completed this summer at the Lisbon Architecture Triennale. It's also a project I did with Onkar Kular. And we were given quite a wonderful brief by curator Mariana Pestana, who had a location in Lisbon, which was an 18th century palace. And during that period, the palace, during the 250 years of the palace's existence, it had been, headquarters, or had been occupied by numerous different institutions. And so Mariana asked us to effectively pick one of the organizations that had inhabited this palace and revive it, sort of resuscitate it in the space. It's a very nice commissioned to receive. And Onkenai chose a group of anarchists who were squatting there temporarily before they were kicked out. They were actually anarcho-syndicalists, which politically I think have a lot of affiliations with, let's say, the original kibbutz settlers. We did a lot of research into the community that had been there, and pretty soon after they were kicked out of the palace, they were basically shipped into exile for the rest of their adult lives. And so they went into all the Portuguese colonies, Angola, Madeira, Cape Verde. These are photographs that we found at the public library. And then they ended up in a concentration camp called Tarrafal on the Cape Verde Islands, which was where political prisoners were held by the Salazar dictatorship. So this was our entry point into another way to try and understand this historical part of Portuguese past, also because it was an architectural triennale, and also during the period, obviously now, where there's incredible social and economic upheaval in Portugal. We thought it would be interesting to revisit anarchist principles and sort of speak about these prisoners. So again, the lens that we looked at this historical past through was a prison drama, which also tends to usually be a kind of love affair between two men, right? Two men who are imprisoned, who collectively in some way either survive the ordeal or try to escape the ordeal. And so we combined this prison drama with a tradition from that era, which was the workers' theater, which was a theater for the people, which was aimed to educate working class people, often who were illiterate, about their own political situation. And we got to read a lot of very interesting disparate texts to try and kind of organize effectively a theatrical play about their internment, okay? So these are our two main characters. They really did exist, Manuel Riju and Mario Castellano. Castellano died in Tarrafal of malaria and dysentery, as a lot of people did. And so we wrote a play where we imagined them trying to survive in Tarrafal, and also to try and imagine them escaping mentally through conjuring up different utopias. So instead of actually physically escaping, they would basically, as a ritual, dream up places to escape to. And those places were influenced quite heavily by some of the material we were reading. And then we designed a set which encompasses physically some of those utopias that they would escape to. And then we built it. So this is the final kind of feel of the set. There's no actors, so it's a kind of haunted set when you arrive to it, and it moves through a lighting and sound a routine, and then you're given a script which was designed by Kobe, a beautiful script. Also, we didn't pay him that enough, I think. Kobe's used to it, but a beautifully designed script. And there are different, physical kind of anomalies. One is a sort of Mars-like planet that they escape to, so they literally escape off Earth and go to an anarchist utopia where people live according to anarchist principles. Another is a jungle where they literally absorbed into the jungle, so they lose even their own humanity. So it's a kind of ultra-anarchist principle where they're not even bound by any kind of hierarchy to the rest of the world itself. And so there's also the prison set, and then there's a kind of looping system that allows people to kind of imagine the play being conducted. So again, hopefully people are encouraged to provide their own content at points within some of this material. I'll go through this. And then finally, the last project I'm going to present is also very fresh, but it's a project I intend to work on for many years to come, and it's called Two Rivers and a Desert in Between, and it's basically a story cycle. So again, another sort of way of a kind of a narrative genre that I'm using to address a location in a historical period, where I intend to tell many different stories about a very specific region in America, which is the American Southwest, Texas and New Mexico, and between two rivers, which are the Rio Grande, which also serves as a border between Mexico and America, and the Rio Pecos, which you can see, I think, which is a tributary. And the idea is that all the stories that I tell in this area are going to be told within those two rivers, but they're going to encompass, ideally, centuries and centuries, maybe thousands of years of time told through different characters. So everybody's sort of stuck between these two rivers, but they're from prehistory, maybe even into the future. And it's also a very personal project because I was born in that region. If you can see, it says Las Cruces up above El Paso, which is a miserable little town in the middle of nowhere. And it's actually only famous at the moment for being, it has apparently the highest concentration of spies in America because White Sands Missile Testing Ground is just next door. So if you can imagine these maybe sophisticated, highly intelligent spies living really in the middle of nowhere, trying to blend in, I think it's quite comical. So again, the story cycle is this area, and it's obviously something that's been done before, like Middle Earth. Tolkien's Middle Earth is again this area that many different stories are told, different historical periods, even though it's fictional. Faulkner created his own county where he staged many of his stories. And I did a residency there, and I'm just going to go through a series of slides. These are photographs I took of the region, mixed with research that I was conducting at the time. And then I'll talk a bit about two of the projects I produced. But I hope this gives you a little flavor of the world that this area provides me as material. I mean, it's quite Gothic. It's very bleak and beautiful. There are a lot of stories of contrabanding. This is the missile. This is where the first atomic missile was tested. Titan missile was tested in New Mexico. So there are very interesting legacies in this space. And it's also, again, a planetary world where you can really see hundreds of thousands of years of, time spanning before you in the landscape. So at the moment, I've produced two projects based in this area. One, again, sort of moves me to something that I know and love, which is cinema. So I looked into a lot of the films that were being produced in the region, literally shot in the region. Some of them you'll know quite well, like Giant, a very famous film with James Dean. And I researched the idea of location scouting, which is people who go in advance of a film shoot and try to find where those locations are going to be filmed. So they take film, they take short films, they take photographs, they send them back to Hollywood and says, look at this beautiful vista, doesn't it look like the West, right? So it's the creation of the image of the West, and sometimes of science fiction, because the two are very closely linked because of these vast, almost planetary, desolate worlds. So I did research into a location scouter who was there, called Bud Wanzer, and I attempted basically to recreate some of the films he might have shot. I'm sorry, that sounds very convoluted. But basically he was present during the time in the 60s and was a film enthusiast and was sending these materials back to Hollywood saying, here's some great locations for you to film these potential films. So this is one of the films that I shot in Super 8. That was screened in a gallery in Geneva. Also, on the old, you get that great sound that you want when you're presenting this work. Okay, the next project, which I just completed this summer, was about a much darker period in American history from the 19th century. There was a period known as the Scalping Wars, where the Mexican government was tired of the Apaches raiding their land, and so they issued a bounty of 100 pesos for every scalp, man, woman, or child. And this was just after the Civil War in America. So all these ex-soldiers, convicts, criminals, marauders descended into this region and initiated a series of massacres where they massacred Apaches in the thousands. And the scalp became this symbol of, very macabre symbol of the kind of savagery available at the time. It's a period of history that's not really dealt with within American history so profoundly, or even within American cultural production, because the Western is dominated by a period that happens afterwards, where it's a little more romantic even in its violence. 6-shooters, the railroad coming in. This is pre that, much darker period. And one of the more even more disturbing as a fact within this era of scalping was that not only were the Apaches scalped, but Mexican farmers were often scalped as well, because it was very difficult to tell the difference between a Native American head and a Mexican head, very dark hair, long hair. And so they just started scalping people left and right. And so I researched a family of Mexicans that had been scalped just along the Rio Grande. And I decided to produce effectively their scalps to comment, one, on the problems that this object creates historically, but also as a thing, because it's many things suddenly. Once it's taken off of the head, it becomes something a monetary object. You can buy and sell and trade with it. It's worth exactly 100 pesos. So people would, say, give me that whatever pipe and I'll give you this scalp. It's the same thing. It was also like a fashion accessory, so people would dangle them from their saddles. And then it became popular among American institutions to display them as objects, even though we know they're part of the human body, their hair. It's a very kind of emotionally distressing thing to consider when it's separated from you. So these are the scalps. This is the family. It was produced by one of my students, amazing fabricator called Agatha Haynes. And I'm going to also demystify the horror of it, I'll show you how it was made. I hope the students also will find it interesting. But you make you paint very elaborately the ear, and then you painstakingly punch each hair individually. And it takes about 2 weeks of hand punching per scalp. So this poor, amazing Agatha spent 2 months hand punching each of these scalps. I don't think she'll ever speak to me again. And she also produced the underside, which we dulled down a little bit. I apologize, it is very gory, and maybe I should have said beforehand, look away. But again, I had very little to do with the quality of the actual thing itself. It's all her. So these were exhibited as part of a show in Paris just now called The Tyranny of Objects. So I'm just going to go through them. I think Alex would have kind of dug it, to be honest. He would have smiled or chuckled in his inimitable way. So this is how they're exhibited in the show. And that's it. Thank you very much.